Okay, welcome. It's God, 11th of January. Welcome to Weekly Marx. We're doing Karl Marx, Chapter 4, Volume 1, Capital, the Princeton version. I wanted to remind folks that there is a kind of structure that, regardless of the edition of Volume 1, that I think it does follow, that we're up to dealing with money form issues and working through what I think is really the, at least the way the translation goes, is seems a little more colloquial or idiomatic or something. It seems a little friendlier as a translation. So anyway, here goes. The transformation of money into capital. Chapter 4. The general formula for capital. Capital begins with the circulation of commodities. Commodity production, commodity circulation, and advanced commodity circulation, in other words, trade, are the historical conditions under which capital arises. Its modern biography starts in the 16th century, when modern global trade and the world market were created. When we set aside the material content of commodity circulation, namely the exchange of different use values, and consider only the economic forms brought forth in this process, we find that the process ultimately produces money. The ultimate product of commodity circulation is capital's first form of appearance. Historically, when capital emerges opposite landed property, it always takes the form of money. Money fortunes, merchant capital, and usury capital. But we don't have to go back to capital's genesis story to see that the money is its initial form of appearance. The same story plays out daily before our eyes. Even today, every new mass of capital goes on stage that it comes to the market, whether the commodity market, the labor market, the money market, as money that certain processes are to transform into capital. At first, the only difference between money and money as capital is that they have different forms of circulation. The direct form of commodity circulation is CMC, where a commodity is transformed into money and reverse transformed from money into a commodity, selling in order to buy. But alongside this form, we find a second one that is quite different from the first, MCM, where money is transformed into a commodity and reverse transformed from a commodity into money. This is buying in order to sell. Money that moves through the second circuit is transformed into capital, becomes capital, and in terms of its purpose, already is capital. Now let's take a closer look at the MCM circuit. Like simple commodity circulation, it has two opposing phases of movement. In the first phase, M-C, or a purchase, money is transformed into a commodity. In the second, C-M, or a sale, the commodity is reverse transformed into money. The unity of the two phases is their total movement. Through it, money is exchanged for a commodity, and then the same commodity is exchanged for money, buying a commodity in order to sell it. Or if one forgets about the formal differences between a purchase and a sale, buying a commodity with money and buying money with a commodity. The outcome, in which the entire process vanishes, is that money is exchanged for money, M-M. If I buy 2,000 pounds of cotton for 100 pounds and sell that 2,000 pounds of cotton for 110 pounds, I've exchanged 100 pounds for 110 pounds, money for money. Now, anyone could see that the MCM circulation process would be absurd and pointless as a roundabout way to exchange an amount of money value for the same amount. For example, 100 pounds for 100 pounds. Much simpler and more secure would be what the person who amasses money does. He doesn't expose his 100 pounds to the dangers of circulation. He just holds on to his money. On the other hand, whether the merchant sells the cotton he bought with 100 pounds for 110 pounds or has to part with it for 100 pounds or even 50 pounds, his money still moves in a characteristic and original way. It's thoroughly different from the movement in simple commodity circulation where the farmer sells grain and buys clothes with the money his sale is freed up. So our next step will be to examine the formal differences between the MCM and CMC circuits. This will also reveal the difference in content lurking behind these differences in form. First, let's look at what the two forms have in common. Both circuits can be broken down into the same two opposing phases, C-M, a sale, and M-C, a purchase. In both phases, the two thingly elements are positioned opposite each other, a commodity and money. And so are two people wearing the same economic actors' masks, those of a buyer and a seller. Each circuit is the unity of the same opposing phases, and in both cases, three partners in exchange mediate this unity. One person merely sells, another merely buys, the third alternately buys and sells. The CMC and MCM circuits differ, above all, in that the same two opposing phases of circulation proceed in inverted order. Simple commodity circulation begins with a sale and ends with a purchase. Money circulation as capital begins with a purchase and ends with a sale. In the former, a commodity serves as the starting and end points of the movement, and the latter, money does. In the first form, money mediates the total process. In the second, conversely, a commodity mediates it. The CMC circuit ends when money is transformed into a commodity that functions as a use value. The money has thus been spent once and for all. In contrast, the buyer spends money in MCM, the reverse form, in order to attract money as a seller. When he buys, he puts money into circulation only to take it back out when he sells the same commodity he purchased. He lets go of the money, but then he does so with a calculating attitude, or only in order to have it in his hands again. Here, then, the buyer merely advances the money. In the CMC form, the same piece of money changes places twice. The seller gets the money from the buyer and then uses it to pay another seller. The whole process, which begins when money flows to a seller in exchange for his commodity, ends when money flows away from a buyer in exchange for a different commodity. In the MCM form, the process works the other way around. The same commodity changes places twice, not the same piece of money. The buyer purchases a commodity from the seller, puts it into the hand of another buyer. When a piece of money changes places twice in a simple commodity circulation, that money is removed once and for all from one set of hands and put into a different set. In MCM, in contrast, when the same commodity changes places twice, the effect is that money flows back to its starting point. Money flows back to its starting point whether or not a commodity is sold for more than it originally cost. How much money a commodity attracts determines only the magnitude of the sum that flows back to the starting point. The phenomenon itself, that is, money flowing back to its starting point, occurs the moment a commodity that had been bought is sold, thereby completing the MCM circuit. We have here a physical and observable difference between how money circulates as capital and how it circulates as mere money. The MCM CMC circuit is completed when a second commodity is purchased and the money that the first commodity attracted when it was sold is drawn away. Money will return to the starting point again only when the whole circuit is restarted or repeated. If I sell 8 bushels of grain for £3 and I use this £3 to buy clothes, the £3 is out of my hands for good. I no longer have anything to do with it. The £3 now belongs to the clothes retailer. If I sell another 8 bushels of grain, then money will flow back to me, but only because I've repeated the first transaction, not as a result of the first transaction. But this money too flows away from me when I complete the circuit, when once again I buy something. So in the CMC circuit, the way money is spent doesn't cause it to flow back to the starting point. But in the MCM circuit, how money is spent conditions its return there. If money doesn't flow back to the starting point, the operation fails. The circuit has been interrupted and is unfinished, since its second phase is missing, the sale that complements and completes the purchase. A commodity is the starting point in the CMC circuit, whose endpoint is a second commodity. The second commodity falls out of circulation and is consumed. CMC's ultimate purpose is consumption, or the satisfaction of wants and needs. In a word, use value. In contrast, money is both the starting point and end point in the MCM circuit. The motive that drives this circuit and the goal that defines it is exchange value. In simple commodity circulation, both the starting point and end point have the same economic form. They're both commodities. They also have the same magnitude of value. On the other hand, they're qualitatively different use values, say grain and clothes. The content of the movement here is that the products are exchanged, that is, different things in which social labor is represented. Not so in the MCM circuit. At first, this circuit seems to be a tautology and therefore to lack content. The starting point and the end point have the same economic form. Both are money. They aren't qualitatively different use values because money is simply the transformed shape of the commodities whose particular use values have disappeared in it. To exchange £100 for cotton and then the same cotton for £100, or to exchange money for money, a thing for the same thing in a roundabout way, seems to be an exercise that is as unproductive as it is absurd. Sums of money differ from one another only with respect to their magnitude. A change that would give content to the MCM process cannot arise from a qualitative difference between its starting point and end point, since they're both money. Rather, such a change has to come from quantitative differences alone, which means that more money is taken out of circulation than was originally put in. Cotton that's cost £100 is sold for £100 plus £10, for example. The complete form of this process is therefore M-C-M prime, where M prime equals M plus delta M, or M prime equals the sum of the money originally advanced plus a supplement. Now, I call this supplement the amount that exceeds the original value, surplus value. Here, the value advanced in the beginning not only remains intact as it circulates, but it alters its own magnitude. It takes on surplus value, valorizing itself. This movement transforms the original value into capital. Now, of course, the starting point and end point in CMC C and C, the grain and clothes, can have quantitatively different magnitudes of value. The farmer can sell his grain for more than its value or buy clothes for less than theirs. Or the retailer selling the clothes can fleece the farmer. For this circuit, however, such differences in value remain purely accidental. The circuit doesn't lose all rhyme and reason as the MCM process does. when the starting point and end point, the grain and the clothes, are equivalents. Instead, the CMC circuit needs an equivalence of value in order to run its normal course. The act of selling in order to buy, i.e., the CMC circuit, is restarted and repeated for an ultimate purpose that lies outside the circulation sphere. And this act finds its measure and its meaning in that purpose, that is, consumption. In other words, the satisfaction of particular wants or needs. But when a buyer purchases a commodity in order to sell it, he begins and completes the circuit with the same thing, money or exchange value, which makes the movement of this circuit endless. M does in fact turn into M plus delta M. That is, 100 pounds turns into 100 pounds plus 10. But from a purely qualitative standpoint, 110 pounds is the same as 100 pounds. It's namely money. And from a quantitative point of view, 110 pounds is a limited amount of value, as is 100 pounds. If the 110 pounds were spent as money, it would abandon its role. It would no longer be capital. If the 110 pounds were taken out of circulation, it would harden into a store of money, and it wouldn't grow by a single farthing, even if it sat around until Judgment Day. When it comes to the valorization of value, 110 pounds is the same need to be valorized as 100 pounds, because both sums are limited expressions of exchange value, and both have the same calling, that is, to go as far as they can in the direction of absolute wealth by increasing their magnitude. The original value of 100 pounds may differ for a moment from the surplus value of 10 pounds that it takes on as it circulates, but this difference quickly falls away. When the process ends, the value that comes out is neither the original 100 pounds nor the 10 pounds of surplus value. What comes out, rather, is a value of 110 pounds, which is exactly the same form as the original 100 pounds, the right form to be in to valorize itself yet again. Money comes out at the end of the movement, ready to begin another circuit. Thus, when commodities are bought in order to be sold, the end of every single circuit represents the beginning of a new one. Simple commodity circulation, that is, selling in order to buy, serves as the means for an ultimate end that lies outside circulation, that is, the appropriation of use values, the satisfaction of wants and needs. But money circulation as capital is an end in itself, because the valorization of value exists only within the constantly restarted movement. The movement of capital thus has no limit. The money owner becomes a capitalist when he acts as the conscious bearer of this movement. His person, or rather his pocket, is money's starting point as well as the point it returns to. The change that gives this circulation its objective content, value is valorized, is his subjective goal, and he functions as a capitalist, or as personified capital, endowed with consciousness and a will, only insofar as the sole motivation driving his operations is to appropriate more and more abstract wealth. Thus, we should never regard use value as the capitalist's immediate aim. This also holds for turning a profit in an individual transaction. What the capitalist wants, all he wants, is the movement of ceaseless profit making. The person who amasses stores of money and the capitalist share this absolute drive to increase their wealth, this passionate pursuit of exchange value. But whereas the money amasser is an insane capitalist, the capitalist is a rational money amasser. When the person who amasses money saves his money by keeping it outside circulation, he is striving after the ceaseless expansion of exchange value. The cleverer capitalist actually achieves that goal by always giving his money over to circulation anew. In simple circulation, the value of commodities takes on independent forms, money forms. which do nothing more than mediate commodity exchange. These forms disappear in the end result of the CMC circuit. In the MCM circuit, in contrast, both the commodity and money function only as values different modes of existence. Money as the general mode, and commodity as the particular or disguised mode, so to speak. Value continually passes from this one form into the other without losing itself as it moves back and forth. And in this way, value transforms itself into an automatic subject. If we stop this movement, freezing in place the particular forms of appearance that self-valorizing value alternately takes on during its life cycle, we will see that capital is money. And capital is also a commodity. But in fact, what happens here is that value becomes the subject of a process in which it changes its own magnitude as it continually goes back and forth between the forms money and the commodity. As surplus value, value moves beyond itself, the original value, valorizing itself. For the movement within which its value grows is its own movement. And so when value is valorized, it is valorizing itself. It has acquired the occult ability to add value by virtue of being value. It spits out live children, or at least lays golden eggs. The value alternately takes on and sheds the value form and the commodity form, maintaining itself as it goes back and forth between them and expanding all the while. As the dominant subject of this process, value needs, above all, an independent form which can affirm its self-identity. Money alone gives value such a form. Every circuit in which value is valorized therefore begins and ends with money. A value was £100, now is £110, and so on. But here, money is only one form of value, which has two. In order to become capital, money has to take on the commodity form. So here, money doesn't relate to commodities antagonistically as it does when it's stored. The capitalist knows that however shabby commodities look, however foul they smell, they are, in their faith and in truth, money. On the inside, commodities are circumcised Jews and also a wondrous means for turning money into more money. In simple circulation, the value of a commodity gains, at most, a form that is independent of the commodity's use value, namely the form of value. But in the MCM circuit, value suddenly presents itself as a substance that is in process and moves on its own, a substance for which the commodity and money are nothing more than forms. And now value doesn't simply represent the relation among commodities. Instead, it enters into a private relation with itself, so to speak. As an original value, value is different from itself as surplus value. That just as God the Father is different from himself as the Son of God, even though they're the same age, and in fact, one person. For it's solely the surplus value of £10 that causes the £100 originally advanced to become capital. And the moment that the £100 becomes capital, the moment that the Son and through the Son, the Father are created, the difference between Father and Son vanishes and they become one, £110. Thus, value becomes value in process, money in process, and as such, capital. Value emerges from circulation and flows back into it. Value maintains itself and multiplies as it circulates, returns from circulation enlarged, and constantly begins the same circuit anew. M-M prime begins the same circuit anew. M-M prime, money, which begets money. That is how capital was described by the mercantilists, its first interpreters. Now, buying in order to sell, or better, buying in order to sell at highs, M-C-M prime appears to be just one kind of capital, the form peculiar to merchant capital. But industrial capital, too, is money that turns into a commodity and then, when it is sold, is reverse transformed into more money. Transactions that take place between purchase and sale outside the circulation sphere, that is, don't affect the form of this movement. Lastly, in interest-bearing capital, the M-C-M prime circuit presents itself in terms of its result in an abbreviated, unmediated, or one might say lapidary form, M-M prime, money that instantly becomes more money, value that is greater than itself. M-C-M prime is thus the general formula for capital as it directly appears in the circulation sphere. Contradictions in the general formula. The form of circulation where money emerges from its chrysalis as capital contradicts all the laws we have explicated up to now. Those having to do with the nature of commodities, value, money, and also the nature of circulation itself. This other form of circulation differs from simple commodity circulation in that it reverses the order of the same two opposing processes, a sale and a purchase. By what magic does a purely formal difference transform the nature of these processes? And another thing, the sequence of exchange is reversed for just one of the three friends of commerce doing business together. As a capitalist, I buy a commodity from A and resell it to B, whereas a simple commodity owner, I sell my commodity to B and then buy a commodity from A. For the participants A and B, there is no difference between these two circuits. A and B enter into the transactions that make up the two circuits only as the buyer or the seller of a commodity. I interact with them in each case as either a simple money owner or a simple commodity owner, as a buyer or a seller. And in both sequences, in fact, it is merely as a seller that I interact with the one person and merely as a buyer that I interact with the other. It is merely as money that I interact with the one person and merely as a commodity that I interact with the other. I interact with neither person as capital or as a capitalist or as the representative of something more than money or a commodity. In neither case am I the representative of something that can exert effects other than those of money and commodities. For me, buying from A and selling to B form a sequence. But the two transactions are connected only for me. That is, A doesn't care about my transaction with B, and B doesn't care about my transaction with A. If I tried to explain to A and B how I profit when the sequence is reversed, they would probably tell me something that, tell me that I'm confused and that the whole transaction didn't begin when something was bought and end when something was sold, but rather proceeded the other way around. It began when something was sold and ended when something was bought. My first act, buying, was in fact selling from A's standpoint, and my second act, selling, was buying from B's. Not satisfied with that, A and B would declare the whole sequence to be unnecessary, nothing more than hocus pocus. They would say that from now on. A will be selling his commodity directly to B, and B will be buying it directly from A. The whole transaction would shrink down to a one-sided act of regular commodity circulation. It would be merely a sale from A's standpoint and merely a purchase from B's. When we reverse the sequence, we don't wind up beyond the sphere of simple commodity circulation. Hence, we have to ask whether the nature of simple commodity circulation allows the values that go into circulation to be valorized and thus surplus value to be created. Let's examine the circulation process in a form which presents itself simply as an exchange of commodities. We will find this form of circulation whenever two commodity owners buy from each other, and when it is time to pay, owe each other offsetting amounts that come out to a balance of zero. Here, money serves as money of account. It expresses commodities' values as their prices, but isn't a physical thing, and this money positions itself opposite commodities. Insofar as use value is concerned, both participants can profit clearly. Each disposes of a commodity that he doesn't need or want as a use value, and each acquires a commodity he needs or wants to use. And this might not be the only advantage for the exchangers. A, who sells wine and buys grain, will perhaps produce more wine than the grain farmer B could produce in the same amount of labor time. And B, for his part, will perhaps produce more grain than A could in the same amount of labor time. Thus, A might wind up with more grain for the same exchange value, and B with more wine than each would have if the two weren't able to exchange goods and had to produce, respectively, their own wine and grain. Now, with regard to use value, one could say exchange is a transaction in which both sides profit. Not so with exchange value. A man who has a large amount of wine and no grain trades with a man who has a lot of grain and no wine, and they exchange grain worth 50 for a value of 50 in wine. The exchange results in an increase in exchange value for neither person because before the exchange, each possessed a value equal to the one he acquired through the transaction. Nothing about this situation changes when money, functioning as the means of circulation, steps between the commodities, and the acts of buying and selling commodities lose their direct physical connection. Prices represent commodities' values before commodities begin to circulate. So prices don't result from circulation. Rather, circulation requires prices as a precondition. Let us now consider simple commodity circulation in the abstract. If we leave aside those conditions that don't arise from its immanent laws, what do we see? One use value is substituted for another, but beyond that, nothing happens except that a commodity is transformed, or in other words, it merely changes its form. The same exchange value, the same quantity of objectified social labor remains in the same commodity owner's hands, alternately in the shape of his commodity, the shape of the money his commodity turns into, and the shape of the commodity into which the money is reverse transformed. This form change doesn't imply that the magnitude of value changes. The change that the commodity's value undergoes has to do only with its money form. Its money form exists as at first as the price of a commodity for sale, then as a sum of actual money, which has already been expressed as the commodity's price, and finally, as the price of an equivalent commodity. In and for itself, this form change implies a change in commodity's magnitude of value just as little as the value of a 5-pound note is altered when one exchanges it for sovereigns, half sovereigns, or shillings. Thus, insofar as commodity circulation requires only that value change its form, this circulation, when it proceeds in its pure form, requires that equivalents be exchanged. Vulgar economists, having no idea what value is, presume that supply and demand match each other, or that the supplies of supply and demand have come to a complete stop whenever they feel like training their own peculiar sights on the phenomenon of commodity circulation in its pure form. If both parties in an exchange can profit with regard to use value, they can't with regard to exchange value. The rule, rather, is, quote, where equality exists, there is no gain, unquote. Of course, it's possible to sell commodities at prices that deviate from their values, but such deviation presents itself as a violation of the law of commodity exchange. In the pure form of commodity exchange, equivalents are exchanged. Now, this isn't a way for someone to enlarge their value. Almost always lurking behind attempts to depict commodity circulation as that which generates surplus value is a quid pro quo. Use value is confused with exchange value. For example, Kondiak writes, quote, it is wrong to say that in commodity exchange we exchange value for the same value. It's the other way around. Both parties involved always give up a smaller value for a larger one. In fact, if we exchanged equal values, neither party could make a profit, but both do profit, or in any case, should profit. Why? The value of things exists only as a function of our needs. Something that has more value for one person will have less for another, and vice versa. We shouldn't assume that we sell things that we absolutely need to consume. We want to part with a thing that is useless to us as a way of acquiring a thing we need. We want to give up less in exchange for more. It was natural to think that in exchange, we give up value for equal value as long as the values of the things being exchanged are equal in terms of gold. But another consideration must be taken into account as well. Does each party exchange something superfluous for something he needs? Unquote. We can see not only that Kondiak makes a jumbled mess of use value and exchange value, but that with all the sophistication of a toddler, he attributes the following situation to a society with advanced commodity production. The producer makes his own means of subsistence and puts only what he doesn't need, that is, superfluous products, into circulation. Yet today's political economists often repeat Kondiak's argument, especially when they say they want to represent the advanced form of commodity exchange, that is, commerce, as the factor that creates surplus value. Commerce, we read, adds value to products, for the same products in the hands of consumers are worth more in the hands than in the hands of producers, and it may be strictly considered an act of production. But you don't pay for commodities twice, first for their use value and then for their value. And if the buyer needs the commodity's use value more than the seller needs the commodity's money form more than the buyer. Why else would he sell his commodity? We just might as well say that the buyer performs what is strictly an act of production when he turns a retailer's stockings into money. When people exchange commodities or commodities and money that have the same exchange value, which is to say when they exchange equivalents, it is obvious that no one takes more value out of circulation than he puts into it. No surplus value is created. But it is the pure form of commodity circulation that requires the exchange of equivalents. And in reality, things don't happen in a pure way. Let's therefore assume that non-equivalents are exchanged. When a commodity owner comes to the commodity market, he encounters only another commodity owner, and the power these two people exercise over each other is merely the power of their commodities. The exchange differences among commodities constitute the material motivation for exchange. These differences make the commodity owners dependent on each other. Neither has in his hands an object that satisfies one of his own wants or needs, while both have in their hands an object that satisfies one of the other person's wants or needs. Beyond this material difference between commodities' use values, there's just one other difference between commodities. The difference between their natural form and their transformed form, between commodities and money. Commodity owners differ only in regard to whether they sell commodities they own or buy commodities with money that they own. Let's now imagine that a seller enjoys an inexplicable privilege. He gets to sell his commodity for more than its value, for 110 pounds when it's worth 100 pounds, and thus with a nominal price increase of 10%. The seller thus collects 10%, 10 pounds. I'm sorry. Let me start that again. Let us now imagine the seller enjoys an inexplicable privilege. He gets to sell his commodity for more than its value, for 110 pounds when it's worth 100 pounds, and thus with a nominal price increase of 10%. The seller thus collects 10 pounds in surplus value. But after being a seller, he becomes a buyer. He now faces a third commodity owner who is acting as a seller, and this seller too gets to sell his commodity at a price that is too high by 10%. As a seller, our man made a profit of 10 pounds, only to take a loss of 10 pounds as a buyer. What the whole thing amounts to is that all commodity owners will sell their commodities for 10% more than they are worth. which is no different from all commodity owners selling their commodities at their value. When we give all commodities a nominal price increase of 10%, this creates the same effect as assessing all commodity values in silver instead of gold. The money names would grow larger. In other words, commodity prices would rise, but their ratios of value would remain the same. Now, let's assume the reverse. The buyer has the privilege of buying commodities below their value. Here, we don't need to be reminded that the buyer will become a seller again. He was a seller before he became a buyer, and so he loses 10% as a seller before he gains 10% as a buyer. All remains as before. So one can't explain how surplus value is created or how money is turned into capital by assuming that sellers can sell commodities above their value or that buyers get to buy them below their value. If we smuggle irrelevant factors into our analysis, this will do nothing to simplify matters. Colonel Torrens, for example, says, effectual demand consists in the power and inclination on the part of consumers to give for commodities, either by immediate or circuitous barter, some greater portion of all the ingredients of capital than their production costs. Unquote. In circulation, producers and consumers interact only as sellers and buyers. To assert that the surplus value going to the producer is created when consumers pay more for commodities than they're worth is merely to disguise the simple sentence that the commodity owner gets to sell commodities at prices that are too high. The seller has produced the commodities himself or serves as a proxy for the producers, but the buyer too has either produced the commodities represented in his money or is serving as a proxy for the people who produce them. A producer faces a producer. What distinguishes the two is that the one buys, whereas the other sells. If a commodity owner sells his commodity for more than its value under the name producer, quote unquote, and pays too much for commodities under the name consumer, quote unquote, we still won't get any farther in our analysis, not even an inch. Those who consistently advance the misguided theory that surplus value results from a nominal price increase or from a seller's privilege to sell his commodities for more than they're worth, thus assume there is a class of people who buy but don't sell, who, in other words, consume but don't produce. From the standpoint our analysis has reached, that of simple circulation, we can't explain how such a class could exist, but let's jump ahead. The money that this class of people buy with must constantly flow to them from the commodity owners themselves without exchange. The money must be free by might or by right. To sell such people commodities for more than their value would be merely to swindle back some of the money that was given away. The cities of Asia Minor paid an annual tribute of money to ancient Rome. With that money, the Romans bought their commodities at inflated prices. The people of Asia Minor fleeced the Romans, taking the route of trade to con back from their conquerors part of a yearly tribute. Yet the people of Asia Minor were still the ones being taken advantage of. The money that they were paid for their commodities was their own money, after all. That isn't the way to become rich or generate surplus value. We will therefore stay within the limits of commodity exchange, where sellers are also buyers and buyers are also sellers. Perhaps our difficulty stems from how we have been conceiving of the persons involved mainly as mere personified categories rather than as individual people. Let me just stop right there. There isn't a section break in here, and I have gone through my allotted time, and I think we can maybe get to the end in our next session tomorrow. And of course, if you've been following along, you have the whole text to work from and to read from that. Let me now look at the endnotes and the editor's notes to finish out our little section here. Maybe perhaps that will help or maybe hurt. Endnote 1, no land without its lord, Money has no master, nul terre sans seigneur, l'argent n'a pas de maître. These French sayings clearly express the opposition between the power of landed property, which rests on personal relations of subjugation and domination, and the impersonal power of money. Number two, with money one buys goods, and with goods one buys money. Mercier de la Rivière, l'ordre naturel est essentiel des sociétés politiques. When a thing is bought in order to be sold again, number three, the sum employed is called money advanced. When it is bought not to be sold, it may be said to be extended. James Stewart. Number four, one does not exchange money for money, exclaims Mercier de la Rivière. In speaking to the mercantilists, in a work that is ex professo about trade and speculation, a work that deals with dealing, so to speak, we read, all trade consists in the exchange of things of different kinds, and the advantage to the merchant arises out of this difference. To exchange a pound of bread against a pound of bread would be attended to with no advantage. Hence, trade is advantageously contrasted with gambling, which consists in a mere exchange of money for money. Courbet, an inquiry into the causes and modes of the wealth of individuals, or the principles of trade and speculation explained, London, 1841. While Courbet doesn't recognize that M-M, exchanging money for money, is not only the characteristic circulation form of merchant capital, but also that of all capital, he at least acknowledges that this form is common to games of chance and one kind of trade, speculation. But then McCulloch arrives on the scene and claims that to buy in order to sell is to speculate. As a result, the difference between trade and speculation drops out of the picture. Every transaction in which an individual buys produce in order to sell it again is, in fact, a speculation. With much more naivete, Pinto, the Pindar of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, observes, commerce is a game. He borrows the sentence from Locke. And it's not with beggars that one can win. If one were to win constantly in everything and with everyone, one would have to give back voluntarily the greater part of the profit to start the game anew. Number five, the capital is divided once more into the original capital and profit, the increment of capital, although in practice, profit is immediately lumped together with capital and set into motion with it. Number six, Aristotle counterposes household management and chromatistics, using the former as his starting point, insofar it is the art of acquisition. It is limited to the procuring of goods that are needed to sustain life and are useful for the household or the state. Pure wealth seems to consist in such goods, for the amount of this sort of property that one needs for the self-sufficiency that promotes the good life is not unlimited. But there's another type of property acquisition which is especially called chromatistics, and justifiably so. It is the reason wealth and property are thought to have no limit. This also makes it clear that commerce means literally retail trade, and Aristotle chooses this form because use values predominate in it. Is not part of chromatistics by nature, for people needed to engage in exchange only up to the point at which they've had enough. And so he goes on to demonstrate the original form of trade was bartering. However, with the growth of that original form, the need for money emerged. When money was invented, bartering necessarily developed into trading commodities. I won't try to pronounce the Greek. And again, now running counter to its original direction, this developed into chromatistics. What distinguishes chromatistics from household management is that commerce has to do with the production of goods, not in the full sense, but through their exchange. It is held to be concerned with money on the grounds that money is the unit and limit of exchange. The wealth that derives from this kind of wealth acquisition is without limit. Each of the crafts aims to achieve its end in an unlimited way, since each tries to achieve it as fully as possible. But none of the things that promote the end is unlimited, since the end itself constitutes a limit for all crafts. Similarly, there is no limit to the end of this kind of wealth acquisition, for its end is wealth in that form. That is to say, the possession of money. The kind of wealth acquisition that is part of household management, on the other hand, does have a limit. This is not the task of household management. For one aims to increase it, whereas the other aims at a different end. Each of the two kinds of wealth acquisition makes use of the same thing, so their uses overlap. So some people believe that this is the task of household management and go on to thinking that they should maintain their store of money or increase it without limit. Editor's note, Marx's version of these quotations synthesizes a number of sections of Aristotle's text, interpolating some of his own terminology. The text comes from Aristotle's Politics. The English translation has been modified to reflect Marx's changes. Now, let's look now for the moment at the editor's notes. One, which comes at the beginning. Gold became a standard for currency in the United Kingdom in 1821, taking over from bimetallism, the use of gold and silver. The use of gold alone spread as a single standard outside the United Kingdom in the late 19th century and became the exclusive standard on and off into the 20th century. Gold finally ended its use as a currency reference when the US dollar was decoupled from it in 1971. What the gold standard provided was a restraint on the proliferation of currency given the metal's rarity and a common reference point for international trade and currency exchange. Non-commensurate currencies could easily be converted to a gold price and back again into another currency. What replaced gold is called fiat money, versions of currency not backed by gold, but now backed by trust in the government that issued it. Editor's note 2. Marx is referring to ancient Greek writer Hesiod's scheme, whereby the age of gold was followed by the Silver Age, which was followed by the Bronze Age. This scheme was later taken up by Ovid, among other poets. Number 3, editor's note 3. This issue came to be known in the 20th century as the transformation problem. Marx presents it per se in Volume 3, Chapter 9. Roughly speaking, the transformation problem becomes a problem because Marx defines value as socially average labor time. And yet prices are assumed to derive from a different process, namely the way forces of competition drive prices towards the average profit rate. Value on one side, prices on the other. Where do the two meet? This so-called problem produced another fault line between Marxist economists and neoclassical economists, the latter arguing that the labor theory of value is an unnecessary hypothesis and that prices can be derived purely from market forces and individual psychology. This obviously guts what is perhaps the single major finding in Marx's project. Editor's note 4. The term rendered here as body is Leib, or Lieb, actually, which has numerous meanings: abdomen, bowels, womb, and is cognate with the English word life, in comparison to another German word for body, Körper, which tends to indicate extension in space or the physical presence of an organic being. Leib often indicates the part of a human being that can die. It also has these strong associations with death, as well as strong associations with the particular phrase, the body of Christ. Editor's note 5. The term translated as worldly is Weltlustig, something like taking pleasure in the world. Only a few occurrences which predate capital. Most notably, Ludwig Feuerbach, one of Marx's major early influences, used it in an 1846 work on religious doctrines of immortality. Doing so to evoke a perceived divide between religion and art, where the latter is thought of as the opposite of pure spirituality, that is, Weltlustig, cynic gottlos, that is, world desirous, sensuous, godless. And then editor's note 6, right well hath thou been tested, this coin's alloy and weight, but tell me if thou hast it in thy purse. It's from Dante La Divina, the Divine Comedy, Paradiso, Canto 24. Now, let me just stop there. And so we've gone through, a fair part, and hopefully moderately close to halfway through chapter 4. And I hope that people, will appreciate that particular peculiar kind of way that Marx expresses his argument. At various moments, he overindulges in trying to make the logic work as a matter of language. It does seem fairly logical at the level of simple algebra, and I hope that people can appreciate Marx's ability to talk about a very simple set of transactions, but have a variety of interpretations. What is interesting more, of course, is when we transfer it into other kinds of metaphors or analogies. For example, language, the the interpersonal interaction of nonverbal and verbal language, or uh, you know the economy of signs, as it were. So there's other possibilities for this. So let me stop since I've gone over time and see whether there's other. Uh, yes, money called sovereign because it rules. Yes, a good point, Larry. Um, does Trump count as a mercantilist when he sees trade deficit as USA giving Canada billions of dollars a year, or is he just a moron? Well, he's a moron and a mercantilist. Who are the mercantilists? Well, everyone is a mercantilist until we see the evolution of capitalist markets. I guess what we see you could and it can be argued that once we begin to see credits or debits being advanced, that we can see the emergence of actual capitalism or nascent or proto-capitalism. Um, that is the intervention of other financial intermediaries, which is really the point that Marx makes in later volumes. So that's I think that covers. Yes, that circumcised Jews thing was a interesting. I don't see a editor's note for it, but you can hunt for that. I think that's one of the advantages or disadvantages of trying to do translations. MCM, like the cheaters who are trying to buy up Eurovision Song Contest tickets by the thousands. Yes, that is actually good. You could say that. Well, they're arbitraging it, aren't they? Though, right? They're they're like ticket scalpers. Yes. Um,
Yes.
so, and that exists in a more formalized form in certain other ways. In how what's it called? Dynamic. I can't remember. There's a dynamic process for reallocating unused tickets or unused season tickets. In other words, you sort of leasing your season tickets for games, and it's being arbitraged, but officially as opposed to unofficially. Um, what's it called? Dynamic. It's not dynamic pricing. It's called dynamic something or other. But anyway, um, I digress. If there are questions or brickbats for the live stream, uh, please feel free. Denunciations, um, interventions. Hearing none, I will stop.